So, welcome everyone to this great debate with the title of The Safe Operating Space of the Planet and How to Avoid Passing It. I don't know if you just saw the previous slide, but just to advertise the fact that there is a town hall meeting at 7 o'clock this evening, if you're interested, which is on a discussion around the carbon footprint of the General Assembly of this meeting, and we'll have people from the Austrian Convention Centre, from the ACV, from here, members of Copernicus who organised the meeting for us, and myself will be there to answer questions and explain a little bit about some of the things we're trying to do to reduce the carbon budget of the meeting. So do come along to that. It's in room G1 at 7 o'clock tonight. So I'd like to kick off. I'm not going to go through the session description. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and you know the context of why we're having this great debate. So I'll just say a few words about the sort of things we want to get out of the session, and then introduce the four speakers. My name's Jonathan Bamber. I'm Vice President of EGU, and there's a slight change to the moderators. The other moderator on stage with me is Stefan Ramsdorf, who is Head of Earth System Analysis at the Potsdam Institute, PIC in Potsdam, and he's also Professor of Physics of the Oceans at the University of Potsdam. So, you know the title. Some of the sorts of questions that we thought we might try and address in this session are things like, how close are we to one of the more critical thresholds, or planetary boundaries, if you believe in such things. We'll touch on that. Is there time to avert passing one or more of these critical thresholds? What can the geoscience community do to reduce the risks? How important is bottom-up versus top-down action to ensuring the least worst outcome? And lots of other questions that we hope that you're going to ask the panel. The way we're going to run this is the four speakers, and we have actually a really, really fantastic lineup of panelists this morning. They are going to speak for around about 7 or 8 minutes each, and then we'll kick off the discussion, and then we'll open up the debate to the audience. So there'll be plenty of time, we hope, for questions from all of you. And make sure they're tough ones. So the panelists, going in order, and actually the order they're going to speak in, are Professor Miles Allen, who is a Professor of Geosystem Science in the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford, and he was the coordinating lead author on the IPCC's Special Report SR 1.5. Professor Sabine Fuss is at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, MCC, in Berlin. And Sabine is an economist currently leading a working group at the MCC, and she was an IPCC lead author on one of the chapters of the 1.5 Special Report. Professor Linda Stegg is a Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Groningen, and she was also a lead author on one of the chapters of the IPCC Special Report, and she works on various interdisciplinary and international research programs and collaborates with practitioners working in industry, government, and NGOs. And last but not least, we have Erica Hope, who leads the cross-sectorial 2050 Task Force and Governance Program of the European Climate Foundation based in Brussels, which seeks to build knowledge, political strategies, and coalitions to drive the transition to a zero-emission society by mid-century. So that's our panel. And I would like to invite Miles to kick off, and I think you've got some slides that you're going to go through.
Thanks, can I use that? So, morning everybody, and I wanted to kick off with some sort of provocative slides, and this one showing some of the recent school strikes on climate, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the US Congresswoman's response to that. So among these, we see this framing. You know, the UN says we're all going to die in 12 years, is what the millennial Tom Elliott says about climate change. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez picks up on this and subtly morphs the framing to the UN says we've got 12 years to fix climate change. Both agree on 12 years. They're slightly different on what the 12 years are for. And both framings, I will argue, are deeply misleading and potentially dangerous. They're a dangerous misrepresentation of what the IPCC's 1.5 report actually said, which I'll now talk about. By the way, I was one of more than a dozen coordinating lead authors on the 1.5 report, but my particular responsibility was this bit, the part of the report which was about how close we are to 1.5 degrees and how fast we're approaching it. So what we did say was we're now at 1 degree, warming at 0.2 degrees per decade, and at that rate we'll get to 1.5 degrees around 2040. The government's insisted on an objective range of uncertainty on that, so we have a range of uncertainty, and that range starts from 2030. So that's where the 2030 comes from on this figure, but what the IPCC absolutely did not say was that we were expecting half a degree of warming in the next 10 years. What we did say was that we are not sure what level of warming we're at the moment. There's some uncertainty in that. If we're already at 1.2 degrees and warming at 0.25 degrees per decade, which is perfectly possible, then we could get to 1.5 degrees before 2030. That's perfectly possible, but what that means is we're already at 1.25 degrees, and so we're talking about a further quarter of a degree of warming, which is about what's happened since 2000. So what's going to happen when all those striking school children are, striving taxpayers in 2030? They look around themselves and said, you told us the world was going to come to an end, and they're experiencing the impacts of another quarter of a degree of warming. I'm not belittling the impacts of another quarter of a degree of warming, but it won't feel like Armageddon to most people. And that's an important point. And I think we'll come back to this, and one thing which I do want to stress, because I think I always miss it when we come on to the impacts of different levels of warming. This is the IPCC's famous burning embers diagram. People often ask me, am I kept awake at night by the prospect of 5 degrees of warming? I'm not, because of RFC3. And I bet most people in this room don't actually know what RFC3 means. It's called distribution of impacts. I won't do the show of hands thing, but what it actually, because I didn't really know what it meant until I delved into it in this report, and it's about the disproportionate impacts of climate change on certain groups and peoples. And this is why I'm not kept awake by the prospect of 5 degrees of warming, because frankly I think the geopolitical instability that will result as we steam through 2 to 3 degrees, as the impacts of climate change and the injustices of climate change become ever clearer to people, will prevent us getting any further than that, and it won't be pleasant. So what would it take, actually, to avoid that outcome? Well, Sabine's going to speak to this, but this, again, the IPCC is said to have said, by the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that we have to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. What the IPCC actually said was, to have a 50 to 66% chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees without recourse to carbon dioxide removal in the second half of this century, we will have to reduce emissions by around 50% by 2030. That's a rather longer sentence, not as quotable, but that's actually what the evidence tells us. And you can put that rather simpler and just say if we don't reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, then we are committed to very large levels of carbon dioxide removal in the second half of this century. We're likely committed to large levels. What this, just to make that clear, every ton of carbon we emit into the atmosphere while we're not reducing emissions, there's a good chance that ton's going to have to be scrubbed back out again later on this century. At current costs, without taking up large amounts of land that would otherwise be used for food production, scrubbing CO2 back out of the atmosphere costs around $200 per ton. And if you do that, that rate at which we're dumping carbon into the atmosphere is building up a debt for future generations at a cool $8 trillion per year. That, I would argue, is what the striking school children should be focusing on. That's, every one of them, in effect, the baby boomer generation is adding $2,000 to $5,000, euros, pounds, whatever you like, per year to their overdraft every year. People say, but we need these 12-year slogans to get people worked up. I think if you told school children that they were being given an overdraft increasing steadily by the next generation at £3,000 per year, they'd get pretty worked up about it. So that's what I would argue climate change is about. It's not an emergency. It's a festering injustice. And that doesn't mean you don't get angry about it. The problem with the framing of planetary boundaries, the sort of act now before we cross a boundary, is that it implies that if you do act now, we won't cross the boundary, it will be fine. So it implies that there is no cost If we don't cross the boundary, and an infinite cost if we do, it's deeply misleading, therefore it confuses responsibility, and it's clearly not working. It's not motivating action. What we need to do, what's my positive prescription? We need to get back to basics, quantifying the cost of emissions. This is how we started off addressing the climate change problem. People didn't like it because they felt that Bill Nordhaus was getting the wrong answer. But actually, if we'd actually quantified the costs of emissions properly, we would rapidly find that it is well worth reducing them. And we would find ourselves in a very different space. But talking about hypothetical or largely invented boundaries is not getting us there. That's my point.
Thanks, Miles. Sabine.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks to the organizers for having me in this illustrious round on this very important topic. I'm going to pick it up where Miles has left it and dive a little bit deeper into how we're actually going to achieve these drastic mitigation targets, and in how far CO2 removal, a very controversially discussed method to do so, actually plays into it, whether it just keeps us within the safe operating space, or whether by doing so we transgress maybe other boundaries. This is taken from the summary for policymakers and shows basically all the 1.5 degree pathways leading to either 1.5 degrees warming at the end of the century. And as you see, the ones highlighted are those that would actually do so without, they would actually do so without even overshooting much during the course of the century. And how do we do that? We actually, as Miles was already saying, need to rapidly decarbonize all sectors very rapidly already now, so until 2030, so you get the numbers already there. But also importantly, what we found out in the report is that what's currently on the table in terms of what countries pledged in the frame of Paris, the so-called nationally determined contributions, NDCs, even if we achieve those 100%, that sets us nowhere on track to achieve this. So in fact, we actually end up with twice the emission rate than what we would need in terms of the 1.5 degree pathways that we assessed in the report. And the third element actually comes a little bit later into visibility here, but is nonetheless important, because in contrast to what we know about from AR5 about the 2 degree scenarios, we didn't assess a single 1.5 degree pathway that would allow us to reach the target without at least removing some CO2, so cleaning up some of the CO2 that we have deposited into the atmosphere ex ante, the so-called negative emissions, or CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And that's been discussed quite controversially, and I get back to that because we also assessed the different options to do so in the report. So what's actually behind CO2 removal? As we see in this graphic, what we normally see when we talk about climate change is we take fossils from geological reservoirs, we burn it, we add CO2 to the atmosphere, and thereby cause climate change. Now, if you actually add CCS, you're not withdrawing any CO2. That's a misconception, but even if you were extracting the fossil fuels without causing any additional CO2, and if you were able to capture 100% and safely store it away, you would at most be carbon neutral. Same applies to bioenergy. Only if you combine the two, you can actually withdraw CO2, because the additionally grown biomass absorbs CO2, and then you don't release it back into the atmosphere when you transform it into energy, but you capture it and store it underground. However, there are also other ways to do that, and most importantly and most known to everybody is probably the enhancement of sinks. Afforestation, reforestation can actually lead to sequestration of more CO2. There is also direct air capture. You can, by means of a chemical reaction, absorb CO2 from the ambient air. Again, you have to geologically store it afterwards. And there's also what we also assessed was enhanced weathering, where you grind certain minerals very finely distributed over larger areas, and then also, again, by means of a chemical reaction, bind the CO2. So all of these are discussed quite controversially, because you might actually, if you want to withdraw that much of CO2 as you've seen in this graph, with any one of those, you run into difficulties with respect to sustainability. With bioenergy combined with CCS, for instance, you need vast amount of lands to grow the additional biomass. So people are concerned whether you are still able to feed a growing population, safeguard biodiversity, and so on. Enhanced weathering, you would have to grind enormous amounts of rock if you wanted to achieve the same scales. And that needs energy as well. Direct air capture is still very expensive because it also needs a lot of energy in order to set that chemical reaction into process that would absorb the CO2. And also you still have to geologically store it. So all of those, we came to the conclusion in the report, are actually coming with their own bottlenecks. They might transgress certain boundaries that according to our own value judgments should not be transgressed. And we assessed also the costs and the potentials of those. And a lot of you that work in these areas might find that the potentials that we came up with as a result of the assessment are actually lower than what you're used to from the literature, but that comes from the fact that we're also taking into account a lot of new literature that has strong constraints on sustainability, and thereby you see lower potentials than what you see in some of the older literature. You also see that costs vary quite a bit. I was already talking about direct air capture still being at the upper end of the cost spectrum, even though we do see a lot of learning lately. But there are also these so-called natural climate solutions around afforestation, reforestation, restoration of ecosystems that we do know quite a bit about and that are quite mature actually in terms of the practices and in terms of the costs that would then actually imply that we have entry points here already in the short term, and that carbon removal might not be the big science fiction that it often gets sold off as in the debate. So what we actually concluded from the assessment is that there are actually a lot of options that would allow us to come up with a geographically and temporally diversified portfolio of the different options that would allow us to remove enough CO2 in order to still enable us to reach 1.5 degree. And I want to end with picking it up again from where Miles had left it with those illustrative pathways, just to give you the idea that even with things being as close as they are with 1.5 degrees, there is still also some choice. If you actually say that you don't like CO2 removal for one reason or the other, there are some pathways that actually work without bioenergy and CCS, and that remove only a little bit of CO2 by means mostly of afforestation and other land use practices. But it would entail very drastic CO2 emission reductions in the short run, and that does not only pertain to the energy sector and to the supply side, but it would pertain to all different sectors that have to be decarbonized very rapidly, and that also pertains to drastic changes in behaviors, lifestyles, and that's actually what my colleague Linda covered in the report. So you see that there is still a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we want to achieve 1.5 degrees, but every single year that we continue to deposit another 40 gigatons CO2 into the atmosphere will actually mean that we accumulate a carbon debt that will, in the end, have to be paid off in terms of us having to extract it or to clean it up again. And as Miles was saying, that will come at a cost. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Sabine.
Does it go on automatically?
Okay, so I think Linda's going to give us more the kind of human psychology of the problem.
Yes, thank you very much. I will follow up what Sabine was already telling. What we did in the 1.5 degree report is also looking at the feasibility of becoming carbon neutral and limiting climate change. And we assessed that along 6 different dimensions. And one of these dimensions was social-cultural feasibility. And that's the dimension I will discuss now. So it's about the human dimension of climate change, of dealing with climate change. And in the report, we discuss 4 different steps that are critical to understand how we can motivate people to accept changes that are needed to limit climate change, or to change their behavior themselves to help limit climate change. And the first step is looking at which behaviors are critical to limit climate change. And that's, of course, not the expertise of psychologists. We rely on environmental scientists in that respect. But if you know which behaviors are critical, it's key to understand which factors motivate people to engage in that behavior or which inhibit them to engage in this behavior. Because identifying these factors tells you what factors need to be addressed, targeted, to change their behavior or to change their acceptability of changes. And the last thing we discussed is different types of intervention strategies to motivate people to change or to accept changes. And we looked at the effectiveness of different intervention strategies, but also to the acceptability. So I will briefly discuss how we dealt with each of these topics. So the main conclusion for each of these topics. So the first, which behaviors can help to limit climate change? Well, there are many things that we can do, that you can do as well. And what Sabine already said, the more drastic the behavior changes are, the more significant the behavior changes are, the less we might need to rely on negative emission technologies. So there's many things that we can do, either engage in these behavior or accept that certain types of innovations are being implemented close to you, for example. So you can install renewable energy production facilities like PV, but also find it acceptable that windmills are placed close to where you live. If we rely more on renewables, demand and supply should be matched more effectively, and batteries or storage facilities can help. We can adopt all kinds of technologies that are associated with less emissions, like electric vehicles or heat pumps. We can insulate our houses better, adopt energy-efficient technologies, change our daily use behavior, like not flying to a conference like this, but rather take a train when possible, or cycle or walk short distances instead of taking a car. And there's also all kinds of embedded energy use to consider. So the energy that is used to transport and to produce the products that we use. For example, reduce meat consumption or dairy consumption. But even if we don't do anything, or even if we do things, we also need to adapt to climate change. And this is also not only a responsibility of governments. People need to take protective actions themselves as well to prevent that they are at serious risk because of the problems caused by climate change, like flooding, extreme weather events, the melting of glaciers. All are already affecting people now. In some part of the world more than in other parts of the world. In the Arctic, for example, the problems are severe. But this also means that people need to take action to make sure that they're well protected. So next we just looked into what motivates people to engage in these type of actions. And it's often assumed by policymakers that people are purely rational. They make away the cost and benefit, and if something has more benefit than cost, they will do it. Well, cost and benefits are not the only thing that motivate our actions. There's much more that is relevant for us to decide whether we engage in a certain action or not. So first of all, we are responsive to what others expect us to do or what others do. So social cost and benefits are also affecting our choices. If we think we are frowned upon, if we engage in some actions, we might be less keen on engaging in these actions. And the other way around, if people applaud when we do some things, we are more likely to do so. A next important factor is emotions. So we might anticipate feeling good or feeling bad when doing certain things, and this might promote certain actions, but also inhibit certain actions. And what research has shown is that people might anticipate feeling good when they engage in pro-environmental actions or in climate actions. And anticipating this feeling makes it more likely that they do so. So there's something positive about engaging in climate action as well. And finally, people are motivated by more moral considerations. They care about nature and the environment, and about future generations, and they're motivated to protect it. So people are also motivated to protect nature and the environment, and that may make that they engage in climate-friendly actions, even if this might be somewhat costly or effortful. Well, now we know what affects people's choices. What strategies then can we employ to promote climate action, mitigation as well as adaptation action? The most common strategies are knowledge, information provision and pricing instruments. Both target mostly the rational choice model, right? They assume that if I just tell people what the problem is or what they can do to change to help reduce the problems, they will do so. Well, we know from research information campaigns are important, it's an important precondition, but seldom sufficient to make people change their behavior. They also need to be motivated to do so or are able to do so. Similarly, pricing is very important, as prices are a major barrier for change, but oftentimes it's not a major barrier, and oftentimes the financial gains of engagement in certain actions are small, and in these cases people might not find them worth the effort. So there are many more strategies that can be employed that more rely on voluntary change of behavior. And that might be particularly effective, even more effective than just the strategies I discussed before. So first, tailored information can be effective. So information in general is hardly ever successful in changing the behavior of people at large. But if you tailor the information to the motivations of people or to their personal situation, it is likely to be more effective. Like I said, people are also responsive to what other people do and think, so providing them with information about how they perform relative to other people, for example, with regard to their energy use, proved also to be effective in changing behavior. Another effective strategy is a commitment strategy, so that where people promise to engage in a certain behavior, then they feel obliged to keep this promise because they're motivated to be consistent. And finally, bottom-up initiatives can be quite effective as well, where change is being organized and promoted from the bottom up, for example, in local communities. And people are more sensitive to change. Yeah, this is my last. So finally, like I said, acceptability is also important because all kinds of changes need to be implemented, policies or system changes or like negative emission technologies. What makes that people find these acceptable? Well, first of all, they are more acceptable when they have more benefits relative to the cost. And then again, it's not only about the financial cost of benefit, but also social, emotional, and environmental cost of benefit. But that's not the only thing. It's also very important to people how these costs and benefits are distributed. So whether everyone would be affected equally included and whether future generation and nature and the environment might be protected. And finally, procedural fairness is an important issue, and that means that people are involved in the decision-making about changes and policy-making, or that at least they have a feeling that they are heard, that their concerns are being taken seriously. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Lots to pick apart there. So next, Erica is going to talk to the subject from more of a policy perspective, and I think an EU policy perspective.
Exactly. Thank you. Well, indeed, thank you very much also from my side for the opportunity to be here in this very illustrious gathering. Indeed, my job, I think, is to follow up my esteemed colleagues with a slightly more political or policy overlay about whether we can stay within the 1.5 degrees limit. And I will focus mainly on Europe. But just as a quick recap of a point already made by Sabine, if we look at the pledges that countries across the world have made for the Paris Agreement, then currently, as things stand, even if those are met, that will take us to a 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which is obviously twice what has been committed to. So there is a lot of work to be done, and that means by everybody, because there's actually only 2 countries that have a pledge that's judged to be 1.5 degrees consistent. And the EU is not one of them. The EU's pledge is certainly within the range that would take us to more like 2 or possibly 3 degrees of warming. So to look at the EU, it is important because although the EU is only 10% of global emissions, it is firstly looked to very much by other countries as needing to lead, basically, bearing in mind its historical responsibility and also the potential that it has to act. In a world of global diplomacy where it's a case of I will if you will, somebody needs to go first, and other countries do rightly expect to see something from the EU. Secondly, of course, the EU does have a lot of financial and intellectual resources at its disposal, and integrated market and a lot of sophisticated infrastructure and so on. So it really does have the means to try out technological and also policy solutions that can then potentially be applied in other parts of the world. So if you like, it's a diplomatic catalyst and a laboratory for the world, potentially. So it's really very important that EU leaders do commit to putting Europe on the right path. So what is the right path for Europe? Well, arguably, net zero emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 is something it should be aiming for. Now, there is certainly schools of thought that that's not soon enough. Certainly that's the position of many European NGOs, that it should be by 2040 or even earlier. And there's obviously a lot of judgments and uncertainties to be made in that. But I would say that from the political perspective, or the perspective of trying to persuade politicians to do this, it was really back probably late 2017 when the political opening to start talking about a new goal for 2050 and the EU strategy really started to open up. And I can say that actually in the beginning when we started talking about net zero by 2050, you felt quite trepidatious going into a room of stakeholders or a room of European Commission officials or others and sort of suggesting, well, maybe net zero by 2050 is actually realistically something we can commit to. So as an effort to try and back up this aspiration, in the European Climate Foundation, we commissioned a piece of work that was looking at the feasibility of whether we can get to net zero by 2050. Here it is. And basically, we worked with a whole set of stakeholders to build a calculator model, a sort of simulation model to look at the emitting sectors across the economy and build some scenarios to see, you know, by doing known levers, could we reach 2050 and reduce emissions to net zero. And luckily, turns out we found out that you can, and that there's a range of different scenarios you can use to get there. And building on what Linda was saying, there are basically the more you use of these behavioural options, the more optionality you have, of course, in the different ways to get there. So there are scenarios that are very much more technological and others that are much more sort of lifestyle driven. But whichever of the scenarios you go for, and that's what this slide shows, you do need to obviously get emissions very low, because if we're looking to go eventually negative emissions, we of course need to actually reduce emissions in all the sectors where we can, rather than relying on negative emissions technologies or natural sinks. So in any of the scenarios, and those green bars show the sort of top and bottom ends of the different scenarios, in power, transport and buildings, you need to get to pretty much zero by 2050. Industry, there is a little bit of residual emissions that, of course, will be left from the process emissions. And, you know, we have started later in industry than some of the other sectors trying to get there, so potentially you could go a little bit slower there and a bit faster elsewhere. And then, of course, as long as there's respiration, there always will be some residual emissions in agriculture. But we do think that there is scope for increasing the natural sink in the EU by means of changing land use practices. So good news, it is possible to get there, but we will need to start very soon, and that includes acting in sectors where we haven't done so much so far, including agriculture and industry. And what we also found is that we think it's possible to get to about 75% of the needed emission reductions in Europe, basically by just further deployment of things that we already know very well how to do. You can see from this graph that about 40% of the emissions, that's the impact of EU REF, is already included in the existing policies and scenarios of the EU. By scaling those up, you can get to about 75% of the needed reductions. The last 25%, however, will need quite a bit more investment in innovation, which doesn't mean inventing new things. It means taking things, and that can be either technologies or business models and ways of working that are existing at pilot level somewhere, and really bringing those to commercial level. So those were our findings, and I mean, we also found you need to be doing more by 2030 than the EU currently is doing, and that doing this can be very beneficial. I summarise. But the good news is that the European Commission agrees. And yes, having said we started last year feeling very trepidatious, starting to talk about net zero, there was a good process of sort of socialising and normalising this discussion during the course of the year, such that in November, the European Commission put forward proposals for a new long-term strategy for the EU. Now, all parties to the Paris Agreement have to submit a long-term strategy to the UN FCC by 2020. So this is the European Commission's proposals for what the EU's one should be. And effectively, it's an update of their 2011-2050 roadmap, which looked at 80% reductions by 2050. And these roadmaps are important because they set the frame for all of the policies that then follow. So the Commission did a big modelling exercise. They've got 8 scenarios, actually 5 of which are still looking at 80%, but there are 2 that are net zero scenarios. One is very much more lifestyle-based, and one is more based on negative emissions technologies. But in a sense, the big message is that they are looking at climate neutrality. And it's a big issue that they say climate neutrality, not carbon neutrality, because that's intended to imply that it's all greenhouse gases. So that's great, but the European Commission is like the civil service of the EU. It can propose, but then the politicians have to adopt it. So the European Parliament has already endorsed that they think this is what the EU should do in a resolution this year. But it's really the governments, the heads of state, that will need to give the proper sign-off. They're discussing it in their different council formations at the moment. They will be having a big discussion about it again in June. The last one got kind of a bit shortened by Brexit. But it could happen basically any time between now and 2020 that they would hopefully sign this off. As for whether they will, there are some member states that have been really proactively pushing for this. Partly because they have their own commitments already that are in line with this. So, for example, Portugal has its own roadmap to carbon neutrality. Sweden has a climate law that's aiming for climate neutrality. France is in the process of making one. The UK, arguably member state, has asked its climate change committee to look at adapting the UK's long-term goal. So there are those options there, but then there are other member states that are less keen. So particularly some of the countries in Eastern Europe are concerned about the costs and the potential social impacts of the transition, and Germany actually is being quite reticent, partly because they know they're very much not on track for their 2020 targets. So that's a bit of an issue. So the last point I just want to make is that the real point is not the objective in the end, it's the strategy and the policies that flow from that. But the big point that's needed about having an objective for something like climate neutrality is that you plan for it, and then you take the insights from that and apply those to the near-term decisions on your policies and infrastructure and so on. And so, for example, if you realise you're going to have to try and electrify most of your heat and transport system, then that has big implications for the infrastructure you will need. It shows you that you need to be saving your green hydrogen for seasonal storage and very particular technical points, and that also doing a lot of energy efficiency is essential to reduce how much electrification you will need to do. So I think embedding this principle of backcasting is very important. We know there is not so much time to play with. we do need to look at where we need to get to, plan back from that, and embed it in the near-term planning. And the EU has actually now asked member states to prepare a long-term strategy and a national energy and climate plan, which is for the near term, that would be reflecting the long-term strategy. So this principle of backcasting is sort of there in the EU governance framework. It's not really working so far. Most member states have actually written their short-term plan before their long-term strategy, but it's a work in progress, and we will get there. Voilà. And then the last one was just some thoughts about possibly how the geoscience community could kind of contribute to the cause, but I think we'll save that for the discussion.
Thanks very much, Erica. Lots and lots of food for thought there. We're going to kick off the debate discussion with Stefan, who has a question for the panel, I think, a question for all of them. And then we're going to take questions from the floor. If you have a question, if you could come up to the mic, there are 2 mics in the center aisle there, and we'll take 3 at a time, and then we'll sort of take it from there and see how that goes. So, Stefan, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, I actually have 2 questions to the panel that came to my mind when listening to this. And the first issue that arose, I think, is one of communication. And of course, we have known about the climate problem for more than 50 years, since the Revell report 1965 basically said it all, that what we're heading for. And so the question is, why haven't we achieved more in the meantime? And what do you think of the criticism that is often leveled at us in the scientific community, that we aren't communicating very well, that the communications from the IPCC are very technocratic, and they don't really reach the public very well. Maybe this is something for the psychologist, and also for Miles, perhaps, because you objected to the simplifications that the politicians make out of the IPCC report. With this, we have until 2030, which to me it seems a valid simplification, actually, but it's not for us scientists to make that. I think we have to communicate accurately, but maybe we shouldn't stab politicians in the back that put it in simple terms. And specifically the question, what is an emergency? I actually looked up the dictionary, and an emergency is a dangerous situation requiring immediate action. Which of the 2 do you dispute? Is it not dangerous, or doesn't it require immediate action?
Okay. Good.
And the second one, actually, just very quickly, with the CO2 removal, I think that's a big story because it's so important in these 1.5 or even well below 2 degree scenarios. Aren't we just promising a herd of unicorns there?
Okay. Great. Do you want to kick off, Miles?
Well, I'm just going to pick on one of those, which is this emergency framing. When you declare a state of emergency, there's no point in asking whose fault it is. So we are actually playing into the hands of the perpetrators. And by the perpetrators, of course, I mean people like me, baby boomers, and I've flown around the world in the past month. Okay, so the notion of emergency makes it seem like a collective action problem which is distracting attention from the real issue, which is responsibility for the impacts of continued emissions of fossil fuels. And this is where I come back to the fact that if we'd stuck to our knitting and focused on quantifying the social costs of emissions and not branched off into these planetary boundaries and planetary emergencies, we would, I believe, be in a very different place. We were making progress back in the 1980s and 1990s. Then people like Bill Nordhaus got what some people felt was the wrong answer, and we abandoned the entire enterprise. If we'd stuck at it and quantified social costs better than Bill Nordhaus was able to do at the time, we might be in a very different place.
I'm going to push you on that a little bit more, actually, because Lord Nicholas Stern issued a report more than 15 years ago where he defined the economic costs of action and inaction, and nothing has happened. Nothing substantive. We haven't, we've followed that path. We've tried to.
Well, can I just ask, how many people in this room, this is the European Geophysical Union, how many people in this room are working on the social cost of carbon? I rest my case.
Sabine, do you?
Yes, I'll take up the second question
unicorns.
On the herd of unicorns.
Herd of unicorns, yeah.
Exactly. So it's true that this has been a very big debate. Actually, already in the context of the 2-degree target, you saw quite a bit of CO2 removal. You didn't dip as early below the 0 line, because that would mean that you would actually withdraw more CO2 from the atmosphere than you're emitting back into it. But there were already CO2 removals going on in those scenarios as well, just to offset emissions that are difficult to abate in some of the other sectors. So there's a difference between gross negative emissions and net negative emissions. So the problem is not so new, but it gets, of course, very, very visible. And what has changed actually over the last decades is that we continued to emit at an increasing rate emissions into the atmosphere. At the same time, we're trying to be more ambitious and even made the targets tighter. So it intensifies the challenge that we're facing by so much more. So I think the scenarios, even if they display such a big wedge of net negative emissions, are very useful because they can serve as an indicator of how late we actually are and how big the challenge is. And as I've shown, there are also scenarios that grapple with a lot less negative emissions, that come to terms with 1.5 degrees with, well, afforestation, reforestation, and technologies that wouldn't actually appeal to us as being particularly science fiction, things that we actually have experience in and that are not of high cost. And they actually give us the option to still reach 1.5 degrees, but the longer we wait, the more we're making ourselves dependent on that. And in that sense, I think we're not really chasing a herd of unicorns, but it serves as a very clear indication of the kind of carbon debt that we're building up if we really want to go for such ambitious climate targets.
Good. Shall I take up the question on why do people, or why is the society not changing, because we knew already for a long time?
50 years, yeah.
Yeah, for 50 years. Yeah, but like I already said in my talk, information provision is not sufficient in many cases. It's an important precondition. You know what you need to know what the problem is, why you need to act, and also how you can act. But it's not sufficient if people lack the motivation to change or if they are not able to change. So you also need to see how you create circumstances that facilitate change. So give you an example that you might all recognize. Oftentimes it's much cheaper and faster to fly to a destination than to take a train. The price difference is substantial, and then it's very difficult to expect that people change their behavior and give up so many benefits that they also find important. And another issue, I can talk about it for
Linda,
hours.
That's not new. That we have known that for a long time, and still we fly.
Yeah.
And still it's more efficient in time and financially.
Yeah, but that's also
so
because...
why is anything going to change?
It's also, it's not only the responsibility of people to change, right? You need also to create systems where these changes are being facilitated. And now the incentives are pushing you to a very different direction. So that's something that should also be considered. And another thing with I can talk about information for hours, but keep it short. So only, and you were tapping on it already, only providing factual information might not always be the most effective strategy. Emotional imaging might be more effective in some cases, but then again you need to be aware that you're not only frightening people very, very much, because if you make the problem huge and people have the idea like, oh my gosh, something bad has happened, and they don't know how to prevent it or limit these problems, they might get paralyzed. So you should not only make people afraid, but also tell them what they can do to reduce problems.
So we all know climate neutrality by 2050 is much too little, much too late.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but considering we're starting from aiming for 80% reductions by 2050, it's a case of iterating, I think. to get there. I mean, if I just come back on the point you just made about how we haven't done enough so far. I mean, I think one point is it's basically it's not close enough to people so far, and it's too attractive to fly. It's too attractive to eat meat. It's, you know, people can hear the noise, but or the information, but it's information. It's dry. It doesn't affect them directly. In the meantime, there has been progress, though. There's been, you know, we have now got a global agreement to try and reduce emissions, which obviously is only as good as then the pledges that the member states will put forward, but it's a starting framework. There has also been a lot of progress in the real economy. So there's a lot of the right technologies and so on there now to do the solutions, if only the political will can be found. And I think what we see now is that as it comes closer and more real for people, seeing the actual impacts happening more, seeing the, well, just basically as we get closer to the wire. I don't know if you saw that analysis that was done by Carbon Brief recently, which shows that the carbon budget for somebody who's born now will be about 10% of what their grandparents was. So this is really starting to hit people, which is why we see the school strikes, which is why we start to see these pledges for climate neutrality in 2050, which is not enough. But so I think there are signs of progress. I just have to remain optimistic about this, but we obviously will need to build on those and go faster.
Right, okay. Miles, did you want to say something really quickly? Because I can see a long line of questions
I just wanted to object to the we all know. We might all know in this room, but does the population of Europe know? I just came back from a week in New Zealand, and in New Zealand, the entire population, from the Minister of Climate Change to Northland farmers, are talking about the framing of their Net Zero Carbon Act. That's procedural fairness. Everybody's involved in the discussion. That is not happening in Europe.
Now, I hope you took a train to New Zealand. Look, let's. That was rhetorical. Let's take the first three questions from the floor. Do you want to introduce yourself and then, yeah?
Yeah, sure. Hello, so I'm Manuel Martin from INRA, so I'm a soil scientist. But I guess I'm not talking as a scientist here, but more as a French citizen and a European citizen and maybe world citizen. Okay. So one question which was not maybe enough discussed is the question of money, maybe, because we talked about cost, but not where to find money for investments. And so we are, so I have 2 points. So first is a call and the next one is a question. So we are a group of French people who think that this money question is very central, and because without money and social equity, some important measures such as taxes on fuel will not be accepted. And we had in France the example, as you may have noticed, of the yellow jacket recently. So two French people, so Pierre Laroutourou, who's an agronomist, economist, and Jean Jouzel, who some of you may know because he's a climatologist and he received the Milankovitch Medal here in 1997. Yeah, I'll go fast. They propose this project, which is the Climate Finance Pact, and there are two main principles. So the first one is the creation.
So what's the question?
Sorry. Yeah, okay, maybe. So the first one is the creation of a European bank, and the second one is the redirection of the money creation by Europe towards ecological transition and so climate change adaptation and mitigation. Because right now, Europe creates large amounts of money for saving banks and also for sustain European economy, and we are talking here about thousands of billions euros. So that is much than what is needed for ecological transition in the different sectors and applying the different scenarios we saw. So this project is...
What's your question?
Sorry, just one sentence.
Because we've got a lot of people behind you.
So...
Ask your question.
Okay, but so just finish. So winter is not coming, but European elections are coming. So we need to push this project in Europe. So please come to see me at the end of the session if you're interested, or go on internet for climate project. So climate project pact. And my question is, I agree that the Europe is a right level, maybe to promote the ecological transition as a laboratory and to make a proof of concept that ecological transition is possible. And so would you, all of you, agree with this point? And maybe would you have further suggestions to citizens, scientists, on how we can promote this transition further in Europe. Thank you very much.
Okay. We'll take next one.
Thanks very much. My name's Rich Blaustein. I'm a journalist in Washington, D.C. And since the topic of negative emissions came up, I wrote on the National Academies had a report in October on negative emissions technologies. I have one question on a specific and one general. I'd like to raise the question of CO2 conversion to fuels. That's challenging, but it is a very real research front. And that's phytoreduction to fuels. And doesn't that imply just a broader shift to some sort of cyclic use of energy and mass by society that mimics the Earth system in some way?
Okay, thanks for that. We'll take one more and then we'll...
Yeah, so I am a hydroclimatologist working at IRD in tropical regions. So I have one comment, one answer, one question, very quick. My comment is we should never forget that the population, the people that will suffer the most from climate change are people living in tropical regions. And this is very often a dead angle in our science and communication. My answer to your question, when you say, why did not we act over the past 50 years? It's very simple. It's one phrase which is in the UNCC Convention, that no environmental action should go against fair trade and free markets. This is embedded in the convention.
Okay, we can talk about fair trade and free markets. And your question?
And so my question is to Linda, because you showed your slide with 6 different set of factors to consider for fighting against, for mitigation and adaptation. And one is economy. So I was wondering, so you talk mostly at the individual level, individual contribution. So I was curious to know, did you discuss or what is your own appraisal of the interaction between the way the economy is organized and the individual behavior? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for those. So the first one was, do we want the EU to be a kind of ecological experiment, if you like, or something like that, I think. And then negative emissions question, and CO2, and then, yeah. Okay, so who wants to kick off?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the negative emissions one. Yes.
Fine.
So, because this is actually quite a hot debate, and what we did in a special report was actually that we revised the very definition of CO2 removal. So for the first time in IPCC history, we now include within the places where CO2 can be stored also products, which is partially an answer already to the question of whether that is considered. However, we did not systematically assess yet the literature that covers the mitigation potential coming from different ways to use CO2 to actually lock them up in products. There is quite a bit of literature out there, and there is also a controversy within the literature about what the lifetime should then be, where the CO2 is actually captured in there, and how much energy is actually used in the process of doing it. But it's definitely a vibrant field, and it's definitely something that will be explored in AR6, and where a lot of things are going on right now. So the comment is very well taken.
Erica, do you want to talk about the EU as or the Europe as an ecological experiment?
I can, although my understanding of the question was it was more what can scientists do to help support the EU doing that. So that's what I'll answer. I don't know if that was correct.
Sure.
Was it? Oh, that's a different version of the question. Well, I'll say what I was going to say.
You are... Go on.
It was just, I mean, a couple of thoughts that are also, what can the science community do to support this? Obviously, despite all of your fantastic science that you're doing. In terms of sort of promoting the transition, I think, and communication efforts and so on, I think we are reaching a point where, it is reaching more into public consciousness what needs to happen, but I think the urgency of it still needs to be better understood and kept high in the consciousness. And I think there's one thought is a suggestion that's been made actually by a weather forecaster, or a former weather forecaster in the UK. I'm sure it's come up from elsewhere, but that actually weather forecasts should be accompanied by sort of climate slots that actually explain the kind of longer term changes that are going on, that are determining then what's happening in other parts of the world as well, and possibly the consequences that will then have for Europe and places closer to home in terms of migrations and so on. So that's one. The Guardian, as you might have seen, is already now including the Mauna Loa CO2 forecasts in its on its weather page, which I think is a helpful thing to help people sort of become more literate with this. And then the other thing is just with the school strikes. You know, this is a fantastic movement that we don't know how long it will go on in the form it is. But I should tell you that I think NGOs and so on are quite reluctant to reach out to the school strikers because they don't want to be accused of manipulating them. But I think scientists are precisely who the school strikers are referring to. So I think there could very much be an opening to potentially, you know, for those of you that are interested, to reach out to the school strikers and possibly work with them, not only to get more audience with politicians, but also possibly to work with school authorities to get more attention to climate science and so on the curricula of schools. So those are just a few sort of practical suggestions that I will stop there.
If I just may add on the school strike, there has been a lot of scientist statements in support, national ones, that German language, Germany, Swiss, Austrian had more than 25,000 scientists, and there's now an international letter by scientists supporting the school strikes, which will appear in Science magazine today, I think.
Okay. The third question.
About the economy and how that's related to individual choices. Very nice question. So I showed you in the start 6 dimensions of feasibility, and economy, technology, institutional factors all define the context in which we make our daily choices. And they define in that way also the attractiveness of different choices. So you can also change behavior by changing the economy, by changing institutional factors or technology. So they're more the system in which we function that drive cost and benefits of different behaviors. And one thing very briefly about the first question about the yellow vest movement, I think this is not so much a discussion about whether people care about climate change, but more about what solution is being proposed. And if you care about income distribution, you should care about income policy and not use it as an excuse to not implement climate policy.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, we'll take the next 3 questions.
Hello, my name is Arjun. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology in Germany. I have a question for Sabina about carbon removal. How much carbon is currently being removed from the atmosphere with these carbon technologies? And these models, to model these different pathways, they make assumptions about the development of these technologies. Is the uncertainty of the development of these technologies taken into account into these pathways? That's it.
Okay, thank you.
So my name is Martin Wisbeck. I work at GEOMA, the Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research, and Kiel University. And thank you first for the organizers for bringing here a very well gender-balanced panel. And I'm upset with my colleagues here in the room. There's 13 people behind the microphone, all men. That got to change, right? We cannot complain about unbalanced panels and don't show up on the microphone here, right? So, having said that, I have 2 questions. One is on the title of the debate. It says, "The Safe Operating Space for Planet." Factual statement. I guess you know what that is. And how to ensure that it's not passed. Miles spoke about that. Interesting framing. I think the big question of science is, what is the safe operating space for planet?
Actually, that is the title of the session. I don't know why it says that.
Well,
remember,
frames
meant to be what
matter.
Is.
We heard from the psychologist, frames matter. Next time, EGU, pay attention. Second question is, all of you talked about Fridays for Future. I love it. And I like it in this way that Miles Allen pointed out. It is, they are talking about the intergenerational aspect of it. They say we hear the politics not talking about our future. They make climate a specific example, but again, safe operating for space for planet, to me, is much more than climate. And my question to the panel is, why did none of you bring up the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development? Thank you.
I'm Søren Thomsen, postdoc at Lucien, often referred as early career scientist. And my question goes to the first speaker, Miles. Maybe I got it wrong, but I had a little bit impression you want to tell the students what they should do. And I think they are so successful because they don't care about this older generation, what they tell them what they should do. And shouldn't the IPCC, after 30 years of working on this topic, and we have still rising emissions, better use this and rethink what they maybe should change in the way we scientists work and so, because I think the students achieved quite a lot in this short time period.
Okay, great. Do you want to take the last one first? We'll go for the last one first, Miles.
The students, yes, the students have achieved a lot in terms of drawing attention to a very important issue. But by setting this, my concern is this train wreck is unfolding before my eyes, that these young people are going to reach 2030, they're going to look around, they're going to think we were lied to, and they're going to get angry. And that time, they're not going to be angry with fossil fuel companies, they're going to be angry with us. Now, that's what I'm worried about, okay? This movement has huge momentum, it has huge oxygen in it. There's no reason why they shouldn't be advised correctly that they're being swindled to the tune of £3,000 per year each in building up this climate debt. That's a big, stark number that you can get excited about. Why talk about 12 years to 2030 when it's not true? That's my point. It's not that I don't. I think I'm fully support. I'm speaking to the school kids tomorrow, and I'm going to be trying to tell them, look, there are very strong, powerful messages you can use which have the great advantage of being true, and that's a good thing. Can I just say that I did a total of about 15 hours. I was just totting it up of public and briefings to ministers, etc., on my trip to the Southern Hemisphere. So I think the carbon intensity of my talks was actually lower than the carbon intensity of my presence on this panel.
Yeah, okay.
I grabbed the mic just for a direct, to reassure Miles, the German school students, they have published their demands, and they have actually worked together with scientists to derive what they specifically demand, and one of them involves the social cost of carbon. They take the official number from the German Environment Agency, Umweltbundesamt, which is 180 euros per ton. So they are asking for a CO2 tax to the tune of 180 euros per ton, which I think would certainly be very effective in reaching climate goals. I don't know what further policy implications it has, but that point is...
Okay. Let's go to the other questions. So it was
about
carbon removal technology.
Yes, I'll take that one.
Okay.
Okay.
And then the 2030 SDGs, which I think is a really important.
All right. So the question about carbon removal is totally justified, because what we see in the scenarios that have been presented and that we assessed in the special report, the way how the CO2 is extracted from the atmosphere is mostly achieved through BECCS, bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage. And it is true that we don't see any deployment at scale so far. So we have very few demonstration going on. There's a plant. I think the biggest plant is actually in the US, in Illinois, and that's an ethanol production plant where they actually capture the CO2 and inject it into geological formation. So it is true that we're totally lagging behind, and some research I've been doing looking into the literature and some back of the envelope calculations show that we would need to, if we're thinking about direct air capture and comparing it to the time that it actually took for solar PV to distribute, we would need to accelerate by a factor of 4. So we're really talking technologically about a big delay and a huge effort here that will come as a cost, and that cost is going to increase as we go on. And also, of course, the scenarios have been criticized for assuming certain learning curves. And of course, there is a certain risk in relying on a technology that might not come to bear in time. So this is also behind the broadening of the scenarios and trying to offer also scenarios that do more in the short term in order to reduce the reliance on negative emissions in the medium term. And that also actually relates quite nicely to the SDG and the 2030 agenda, because in the report we actually had a whole chapter on the implications of climate change mitigations for the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially carbon removal featured as a very important one, because we might actually transgress on other SDGs. I was mentioning, for instance, food security. If we have to reserve large amounts of land for afforestation, growing biomass and that also applies to safeguarding our terrestrial biosphere. So there is a lot of material on there, but I don't want to end on a negative note, because there are also opportunities to put climate change mitigation into the broader frame of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs to identify synergies. And we've been talking a lot about missing incentives here and so on, but I think one reason of inaction is also that also strong climate action will have distributional consequences, which is a big inhibitor into getting into these rapid transformations. And putting climate change mitigation in the broader frame of the SDGs also opens up opportunities. Just imagine if you had a global carbon price and you would use the revenues, you could go quite a long way financing a lot of the SDGs and dealing with injustices that have also been topic of Miles' talk in the beginning.
One more thing about, very briefly on the SDGs.
Yeah,
there has
talk
been an
about
assessment that. in the report about the impact of mitigation strategies on the SDGs. Sabine already mentioned it. And for me, it's not my expertise. I think that's the reason why we didn't discuss it, because it's none of our expertise. But there's a nice figure in the SPM. And the interesting picture is the conclusion that you can draw is that there are many synergies, so many positive impacts of climate action on the SDGs. There's also some negative, but the positives seem to be more prominent.
Do you think so? Because I think there are some real conflicts with the SDGs.
No, but if you look
because
at
you know, raising people out of poverty means that their energy consumption will be higher, and it depends exactly what form that energy is in. A couple of years ago, we had the director of Oxfam give a talk, and you know, they are totally committed to that, to raising people out of poverty. Yeah. But there is a carbon cost associated with that currently, however you do it.
Yeah, but it's also, if you take climate action in time, many poor people will be protected because they are more vulnerable. So there's a figure that you can see the synergies and trade-offs for the different SDGs, and if you look at it, the overall picture is that there are potentially many benefits as well. There are, of course, risks as well.
So it's a challenge, but we knew that. Okay.
Yeah, Milan Klöver, University of Oxford, and I really appreciate your global perspective, but I want to have one question that kind of like comes back to us, basically, going on big conferences and flying less. So, I mean, you're all registered for this conference, and there was this option, if you come from Australia, you can donate 25 euros to offset your flight, compared to the flight that we've seen is probably 100th of what the actual price of carbon is. And so I'm questioning, because there are webinars all over the world where people use digital technology to actually come together to communicate. And I know that all of you're really experienced in discussing everything, but why is it for a conference like EGU not possible to have a live stream? Why is it not possible for speakers to speak if they are in Australia?
Okay, no, we've got your question. I would just answer that now. This is being live streamed right now.
Okay, wonderful, but many of the other sessions are not, right? And so this is, I find in an age where we have to talk about solutions, I find it really embarrassing if we don't find our solution for ourselves.
Okay, thank you. Go, really quick, go on then. Yep, and then we'll...
So just to layer on how much you need to hate me, I actually came to this meeting via Saudi Arabia, and what was interesting was it was about CCS and genuine geological offsetting, the meeting there. The person from the international air travel was much more reluctant to talk about it than the government of Saudi Arabia was. And I think that was very interesting.
Okay, so we'll take two more questions. Yeah.
I am Paul Kellogg.
We'll give it a go. Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
I am Paul Kellogg, a professor of physics at the University of Minnesota. Since I was in high school, the population of the Earth has tripled, and this is the primary driver of climate change. I have not heard very much about population increase in this very good discussion, but I don't think that any of the things you have discussed will compensate for the increased energy needs of an increased population. So I beg of you, a primary subject for the IPCC should be how to control the Earth's population. Thank you.
Okay, so in case some of you didn't hear the question, it was more a plea that the IPCC should consider ways to control population growth. Interesting. We'll take one more, and then we'll take the third question.
Hi, Nick Everard, hydrologist working for the Environment Agency, but more importantly, citizen of the planet. I wrote my question on my phone to try to keep me succinct, but it reads, businesses are strong, scientists and even policymakers are weak in impact on people's day-to-day life. But I would like to propose that well-presented science storytelling can make a big change. And the example I want to give is the 14 minutes out of 7 hours of programming given to plastics in Blue Planet, and the change that's made to the people who saw it. And if we could do the same storytelling for the climate story, maybe it would make a difference.
Okay, I will just... the BBC are doing exactly that next week. Climate Change, the Facts. I think the 17th of April, I think. But yeah, okay. I mean, I think the BBC have actually got that message, but yeah, okay.
Well, Netflix has an Attenborough show, which I think relates climate impacts to wildlife and so on.
But I think it's a question about kind of science storytelling. I think so, maybe, yeah. So yeah, we'll take those three.
Jonathan, if I may, my question tags on to Professor Krugman's. May I add it as a fourth, because they can be...
Go on then, go on, Gerrit. You special dispensation just for you.
Thank you. My name is Gerrit Roy. I'm a soil physicist at the Umweltforschung, the Center of Environmental Research in Germany. I agree with Professor Krugman from Minnesota. I make it a little bit more poignant. 6 billion people is probably not within the safe operating space of the planet. We rich Westerners have an energy and a carbon footprint that is about 1 or 2 orders of magnitude larger than those of the poorest parts of the planet. How do we achieve drastic population reduction in the West before the planet does it for us in the poorest part of the planet? Thank you.
Wow. So the first question, webinars. I'm not sure that's kind of, I mean, I don't know if the panel wants to tackle that. I can say a few words about what EGU is doing. And actually, it's very expensive for us to web stream these sessions. So in the larger rooms, we web stream all of the, I think there are 4 rooms where we do the web streams. But there are multiple reasons why people come to meetings. Okay, you want to present your science, but a very important component is networking. And until we can find a mechanism for effective virtual networking of 16,000 scientists, you know, it's not going to be the optimum solution. And, you know, I should say one last point on that is that, as I mentioned at the start, we have a town hall meeting on the carbon budget of the General Assembly at 7 o'clock tonight in room G1. Come along and hear what we're trying to do and offer some suggestions of things we can do to improve the carbon budget as well. So come to that this evening.
Can I just say as well, I came by train and I wouldn't have come if I would have had to fly.
Now, following up your point, and next to networking, it's also social relationship building. I once was in an EU-funded project where we decided not to travel, not to have meetings, or hardly have meetings to reduce carbon emissions. And it was not a smooth project. We had a lot of fights because the social aspects that you need to build relationships to get the collaboration to go more smoothly. But to other questions, population growth, very good point. We did address it very briefly in the report, that this is also a factor contributing to climate change, but there's very little literature looking in how you can reduce population growth in the climate context. And the assessments of the IPCC are based on peer-reviewed literature. So that's why we didn't discuss it in very much depth. But it is mentioned indeed. And the storytelling.
Yeah. But Gerrit's point was that 6 billion is probably not a sustainable population for the planet, particularly if it's 6 billion people with a Western lifestyle.
Yeah, that was a point that I wanted to make as well, because the number of people becomes particularly a problem if they also produce a lot of emissions, right? So it's about the carbon intensity or the environmental impact of lifestyles that makes it a problem. Do you want to add?
Yeah. But just to that, I mean, I think we need to be very, very careful about that framing. I mean, I think in round numbers, the world in 2060 or something will be, 4 billion Asians, 4 billion Africans, and 1 billion rest. For a room full of basically the rest to talk about reducing the population in 2050 is very problematic, because you're talking primarily about people who aren't here. And, I think population actually is one of the few good news stories over the past. I mean, if you think about what the projections for population were 10 or 15 years ago, I think, fortunately, thanks largely to the women in developing countries, we are actually on a much better path there than we thought we might have been. But I think it's very difficult to start those conversations, particularly in this kind of environment.
Can I just add on that? I mean, I think, well...
Yeah, it's a good point.
It's a good point, but I think it's not... one of the, obviously, the best way to bring down population is to educate women and provide family planning support for them. And I think it's very clear there is a big latent demand for that. And so, but I agree, it could be classified as a climate policy. It is already one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think it's a win-win if we do invest in that.
Okay, and the third question, I don't know if you, was the storytelling,
yes.
And I think that's an interesting...
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting point, and it's probably more effective than just coming up with factual information, because you're more likely to engage people and to make them think about things. But then still, it will only be effective if people are, if you also tap on people's key motivations, and if people are able to change. And with plastic, changes are more easy, less personally costly than a lot of climate actions that we want.
But can I just expand on that, the principles of that question, which is, so the storytelling, and in that particular example, is the role of the media.
Yeah, the role of the media is very important. What you also see, I forgot to say that in my talk. People not only receive messages like from the IPCC about that climate change is a problem, they also receive messages through the media from people who deny or climate change or are skeptic about climate change. And the media have a principle of hear and of the different perspectives. So there's a relatively, considering the amount of people who deny climate change or who are skeptic about climate change, which is a very small percentages, we know from research, less than 10% over in the US. In other European countries, we have a huge data set showing that it might be as little as 2% of people who truly deny climate change. But still, there's a lot of attention to this type of messaging in the media, because the media has a principle that every party should have a say. So it is important. Does it address your question?
Yeah. So you mentioned the US. I think, I don't know the exact numbers, but there was a statistic. So I think it's, I don't know, 60, 65% believe climate change is real. But when you ask them whether it'll affect them, the percentage is very low. I don't know the exact number. But when it comes to the individual level, they don't have the concern.
It very much depends on how the question is phrased. So if you ask, do you think it has a positive or negative impact? Most people think it has negative impacts to them. So maybe not immediately now, but overall, over the world, it has negative impacts. They acknowledge that. But if you ask them, if I ask you, do you think it has now negative impacts on your personal life, what would you say?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I think many people don't notice the personal impacts yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm a glaciologist, so it's yeah, it's pretty bad news for my discipline. But yeah, Miles, did
yeah, just something that this roomful could do about this, which is, again, you know, 15, 20 years ago, we stopped really working on quantifying the cost of climate change because we all agreed it's going to be 2 degrees, therefore it's not really worth worrying about whether 2 degrees is more or less expensive than 1.5 because we've already decided what the answer is. And in the 1.5 report, lots of people were asking us what is the global economic benefit of maintaining temperatures at 1.5 degrees versus allowing them to rise to 2, and we weren't able to answer that question. Now, clearly it's a very loaded question, loaded with all sorts of value judgments and so on, but the science base wasn't even there for doing the basics. So this community is letting the world down by not quantifying the cost of climate change in the way we could be doing. I've not heard of major EU initiatives to quantify the social cost of emissions. It's not regarded as a priority. Why not?
Okay. We'll take some more questions.
Okay. Hi, I'm Antti Lari-Partanen from the Finnish Meteorological Institute, and I would like to ask about the role of land use change in forest sector in the EU 2050 climate policy or strategy, because in reading the report, it seems that they are counting this sector as effectively as negative emissions. And what do you see? What is the correct role of this sector in net emissions? Because I think if we are basing it on counting also natural sinks, which is part of this sector, as anthropogenic sinks, then we are kind of underestimating our required emission reductions. Thanks.
Did you get that? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, hello, I'm Lisbeth Florenti, aerospace engineer and carbon cycle scientist from Wageningen University. And I would like to raise the issue of air travel, which of course has a large impact on the global carbon budget, which impact is only expected to rise in the future. Of course, this has already been discussed, but usually from a bottom-up approach, where basically we are expected to fly less. But personally, I do not believe that we can expect the people to give up their ease of mobility. And I think that in this case, a top-down approach might be much more effective. And therefore, I wonder why it is so hard for the international politics to really ask for ambitious plans from the aerospace industry.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Siv Løseth from Norwegian Research Center. I have one comment and one question. So this debate is called Safe Operating Space for the Planet. 70% of this planet is ocean, and it has not been mentioned once in the debate. What does 1.5 degrees and the mitigations necessary to get there mean for the oceans? None of the CDR methods, with the exception of direct air capture, will limit or even remotely decrease ocean acidification. This should be mentioned. It's part of the story that a lot of our planet is ocean.
Okay.
My question is actually completely unrelated to this. It's more about energy use. So about 80% of the energy used in the world comes from fossil fuels. Less than 10% is pure renewables like solar and wind. And we're assuming, that we can transition to renewable energies very, very quickly. Is this even remotely realistic, this optimism that we have in technology development in renewable energies, that we can get where we need to go in as little time as we have?
Okay, thank you. So the land use change in EU policy.
I'll take that one. It's a very good question because there's actually a lot of confusion about this as well, in the context of carbon removals especially. So sinks, actual forest that's standing there and sequestering CO2, that would actually not count for a CO2 removal in the sense of trying to reach the 1.5 degree target, for example. So the CO2 has to be sequestered in addition to what is already sequestered by existing sinks. So you have to enhance the sinks to actually for that to actually count as a carbon removal. And in the definition, we have taken care of that as talking about intentional actions that would lead to the withdrawal of CO2, so afforestation, reforestation, but also if you abandon land so that there can be natural revegetation, that would all count on top of that. But an existing sink would be an existing sink. That's true.
Okay. Well, yeah, let's go on to the second question was air travel, bottom up versus top down. I think we could broaden that actually because I think air travel is about 5% of the total fossil fuel emissions budget. You know, top down versus bottom up across the sector, all forms, you know, transport, household, energy, everything.
The reason we've made no progress over the past 30 years is we've thought of this as a rationing problem. We didn't solve the ozone problem. We didn't save the ozone layer by rationing CFCs. We saved the ozone layer by making fluorocarbons ozone friendly. We need to decarbonize fossil fuels. We're not going to stop using them. We know how to decarbonize fossil fuels. You just need to make sure that enough CO2 goes back underground to compensate for the CO2 released by the fossil fuels. The global air travel industry could make itself carbon neutral tomorrow if it wanted to. Nobody's even asking them to. The global fossil fuel industry could be carbon neutral within a decade or two if somebody asked them to, but nobody's even asking them to. The reason is we talk about planetary boundaries and individual responsibility and collective and so on, and we don't actually go back to the root cause of the problem, which is people selling something a highly lucrative product that's causing problems for our grandchildren. That's the way we should be addressing the problem, and if we did, it suddenly becomes entirely solvable. If you look at the cost of achieving the 1.5 degree, completely decarbonizing the world energy system by 2050 in the 1.5 degrees report, it's $850 billion a year for the next 35 years. It's an eye-wateringly large amount of money. It's less than 10% of what we currently spend on energy. The one institution in the world that has the resources, the technology, and the access to capital to solve this problem if it wanted to is the global fossil fuel industry. And nobody's even asking them to try.
So, to paraphrase, it's a complete lack of leadership by the leaders.
But before you clap, it's a failure by the scientific community in the way we framed the problem. This is not a social problem. It's not even really an economic problem. It's a waste disposal problem. The nuclear industry is not allowed to put its waste into the atmosphere. Why is the fossil fuel industry allowed to do so? And that might be one for Linda.
Do you want to answer that? Or not?
I do want to say something about your question, bottom-up or top-down.
Yeah.
I think both are needed, and that's also indicated in the report. All actors need to take action, and I think top-down measures are needed if the circumstances drive people
Linda,
to...
both are needed, and everybody would agree on that, but without the leadership...
True.
And, you know, people won't follow without the leadership, surely.
I fully agree. We need leadership.
And so how do we achieve that?
Well, we have an influence on that as well by voting for the leaders that might help us to arrive at that position.
I fully agree. Yeah, I mean, just slightly more specifically on the air travel bit. I mean, I think one of the challenges with air travel from the EU perspective is it's hard to allocate responsibility for who are the emissions coming from, which is why it's not something to do unilaterally. They've tried to deal with it in this multilateral body called IATA, but it really hasn't worked well because it's far too led by the industry, who obviously have a completely vested interest in not doing anything to the industry. So I think the time has come for some more political leadership and taking back control of this and the crazy tax breaks that the industry has and so on. And I guess part of the hope is that as the framework becomes closer and the idea of what the limits are is more set into the law, it will become more obvious that's what needs to happen. And I think one positive thing is that the emissions from international aviation are now being included in the EU's objective to get rid of or to get to net zero.
Do you want to remind them of the last question?
Yeah, maybe one follow-up question on that. The EU, of course, has tried before to include air travel, and it was blocked by China and the US. Can you comment on that?
They tried to include it into the emissions trading system, and it didn't work. So they have to keep trying. I mean, none of these ones are the way things have been in the past. It's not we are talking about big change here. That's what's needed, and so we have to also. No, I don't have an answer.
Perhaps
the third question.
Well, perhaps the answer is an alternative to capitalism, but that's maybe a different discussion.
Okay, so the third question was that we're only at 10% renewables now, and can they even be scaled up to supply 100%?
Maybe I'll take that one because the scenarios that we have been assessing in the report have often been criticized. Well, on the one hand, you see this massive scale-up of renewables that probably motivated these questions. On the other hand, they often get criticized for being overly pessimistic about the potential that renewables pose. And some research that has looked into comparing what the forecasts were by assessment bodies, not only the IPCC, but also IEA, and then comparing that to the actual experience that we've had, for instance, with solar PV, shows that in reality, the scale-up can actually be even faster than what we see in the scenarios. So I would be optimistic on that one at least.
Okay, I will take, I think, a couple more questions, and then we're going to give the panel an opportunity to wrap up. So, yeah, I think 2, yeah, 3? 3? Ah, 3. 3, okay. 3 questions.
All right, hi, I'm Clément Moissart. I'm working in space plasma physics, so I apologize if I'm a bit off the mark. But there is this trending idea that you can kind of solve global warming by global solar radiation management, with, for example, putting sulfate in the air. And if you frame the question of global warming around temperature, technology, and economy, this solves all the problem really easily because it's cheap, it's really feasible, and it stops global warming effectively. But I am terrified with this idea, and I'm sure most of you are actually. How do we make sure that no politics or industrial takes it seriously? Because if you look at the numbers, it looks very tempting to actually do it. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Harry Taylor from the University of Bristol. This kind of relates to the blue planet sort of question, but within the blue planet, the onus is put on the consumer to reduce plastics or clean beaches, and that's just not going to make any difference. Surely there is some sort of onus on the media to put pressure on big business when it comes to climate change. There's nothing there. It's always go down to the consumer, so surely we have to put some pressure on big business.
Hello. Hi, I'm Ananya from India, and I'm from the tropics, and I'm here for the gender representation as well. Yeah, so my question is mainly to Miles Allen regarding the distributed impacts of climate change. And so do you think that the term climate emergency makes more sense and has more relevance to these regions which are more impacted because of the distribution of impacts? And also, do you think that the contribution or the onus of owing up to the climate change should be given to, should be considered in terms of the distributed impacts. Regions which are more impacted might be less responsible for it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Did you get those? Yeah, though. Yeah.
May I ask a little question?
I think we're really up against it actually. So we'll take those three, and if you could keep it relatively brief, because I do want a kind of short wrap up. So.
Yes, so I'll take the one on solar radiation management, the first one. And I want to emphasize that it's really important. In the past, solar radiation management, carbon removal have been put into the same bucket, but we're really talking about two different pairs of shoes. In a special report, we're actually using that term geoengineering only once to say that we won't use it in the report, because it's actually a bad communication to deal with those, because they're as the same, because they're actually coming with very different sets of risk. And I think that is actually already one way to reducing the risks, that people will just go for it because it's cheap and effective. To make transparent that with carbon removal, you're actually cleaning up some of the mess that you've made. But with solar radiation management, you're just addressing the symptom. You're just regulating radiation directly in order to achieve the temperature that you want. But all the other effects that are still ongoing because of rising CO2 emissions will be ongoing. And that links back to the question about ocean acidification, for instance, that was made before. So I think to be very clear about that and improving our communication from the science part will already help doing so.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Should we?
I can wrap up as an answer. Yeah. All
Okay.
in one. Yeah. Is that?
Wrap up.
Will that work? I thought that was the idea.
Wrapping up now.
I thought we were doing the down the line at the end.
Not yes, yeah, but we haven't got to that quite yet, because we haven't. I think, what were the other two questions? I didn't catch them. Yeah. Big business, climate justice.
Well, in answering those questions, I will be wrapping up. So
Okay.
I'm offering,
well, I thought the audience would particularly appreciate it if you wrapped up by providing us with grounds for optimism and convincing us that we won't be having this exact same debate in 5 years' time and asking the same questions.
Okay, well, with that challenge, so I think the question was absolutely right, that the problem is this focus on the consumer and not on the root cause of the problem. And we will be having this debate in 5 years' time if we don't reframe the problem as the way we should have, with hindsight, it should have been framed in the first place, a waste disposal problem for an industry that can well afford to dispose of its waste. And on the SRM question, if an industry told you, we're going to carry on pouring acid in a lake, but don't worry, we're going to pour lime in the lake as well, and that'll neutralize the impact of the acid, they would simply be told, no, sorry, that's not acceptable. And that would be, if the fossil fuel industry said, we're going to address the impacts of our emissions by solar radiation management, they would be laughed out of the room. So as soon as you start thinking of it as the responsibility of the industry to clean up the consequences of the product they sell, then all of these complicated problems like should we resort to SRM and so on go away, because it's obvious that that wouldn't be an acceptable strategy for the industry to take. So that's how I think we need to reframe if we want to avoid the Groundhog Day of having these debates again and again and again. Why is it still not working? We need to take the problem to the people who can afford to solve it.
Thanks, Miles. I'm not feeling super optimistic yet, so let's see if things improve as we
I'm going
go
to
down
try
the
to
line.
make you more optimistic. I think in order not to repeat that discussion that we just had in 5 years from now, we will need a more optimistic narrative to start with, a more positive attitude towards climate change mitigation. A lot of what we've still been discussing has been framed around the idea that we have to sacrifice something. Oh, we're not allowed to fly, we're not allowed to eat meat, and a lot of things won't be possible anymore, all this development, all these people that are still going to be born and so on. So I think as long as we're stuck in that narrative and don't also see the opportunities that come with achieving the climate targets that we have, we will actually be repeating this in 5 years' time again. And I think that scientists can make a difference here in terms of communication, in terms of improving communication. I think we haven't done a very good job in the past. And Linda has testified to that as well with respect to how that wraps off on behavior. But I think if we adopt a broader vision of climate change mitigation within the SDGs, and we've touched on a couple of very interesting entry points here. Erika was mentioning gender equality coming into the population dynamics and taking pressure out of the system as such. We've been talking about food security and so on. I think having a broader view on that will help us to get this more positive narrative going.
Okay, I'm feeling a little bit better.
I fully agree. So and there are many positive consequences as well. So 2 points. I think it's oftentimes underestimated how much support there is for all kinds of changes in climate action. If I ask, for example, in audience how many people do deny climate change, I get percentages of 20 to 60%, while what I just said, the percentage is only 10% or so. And also, oftentimes policymakers seem to underestimate the amount of change that people are willing to make and the amount of the room they have for implementing all kinds of policies. And also, if some governments try to implement more stringent policies, oftentimes it revealed that support increased even over time because people noticed that it also had positive effects. And now I forgot my second point, sorry.
That's okay, that's okay. Erika.
Thanks. Well, I think all of the work on 1.5 that's looking at can we do it, it shows it is possible to still stay within that limit, but it needs to happen fast. The efforts need to happen fast, and we need to be making big changes. And I'm sure we've all read these studies and said to ourselves, is that really possible? Well, I don't know, but the Stern Review came out 1 year before the iPhone. And can you see now how fast digital communications and the way we work and communicate and so on has happened? So change can happen very fast. And I think now with climate change, the awareness is there. I think the political frameworks start to be there, work in progress, but still going on. Now I read recently, I think it's 2/3 of millennials want to work in green-collar jobs. The companies know, the car companies know that the end of the internal combustion engine is coming, and they're working hard to make that shift behind the scenes, if not publicly. Consumers also are becoming more aware, and consumers, of course, can put pressure on the companies as well as the media. And of course also, as we've said, many of the things that need to happen bring huge benefits in other respects. The types of changes that are needed, cities that we can breathe in more easily and move in more easily and so on. So changing the narrative, but also just the reality of the fact that people will start to recognize this makes me optimistic. I think we can do it.
Okay, I think Stefan...
Just a very short wrap-up optimistic message. My optimistic message is that you can all make a difference, so please don't stay in the ivory tower, but go out there, engage in the public debate. And I double-checked this support letter by scientists for Fridays for Future will be published online at 8 p.m. Vienna time tonight in Science. And if you feel like it, please sign on to it.
So I'd like to thank you, the audience, for a really stimulating set of questions. But of course, I'd really like to thank our panel for an absolutely fascinating discussion and debate this morning. Thank you very much.